Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second week of the SunoikisisDC Digital Culture Heritage Fall 2019. So today we talk about 3D imaging and in particular photogrammetry, but also 3D printing. And our speakers for today are myself, I'm Valeria Vitale, and we have Emma Payne from King's College London, Gabriel Bodard, that is at the Institute of Classical Studies with me, and Alicia Walsh from the University of Leiden. So we will be, I will start with an introduction about digital imaging and the tradition of copying, and then I will hand it over to Emma for a more technological insight, and then Emma and Gabi will discuss some applications, and we will end with a photogrammetry tutorial for our exercise, and Alicia will dialogue with us at any point. She is our free card. So let's start with a few words about 3D imaging and photogrammetry, but the way I wanted to start this class is actually situating 3D imaging and any other 3D any sort of imaging technology, not as something shiny new that we have just acquired, but as something that positions itself quite nicely in actually a very long tradition, very established tradition, which is the tradition of copying and documenting ancient objects, which is something we're very familiar with. It's something that we've been doing, for ages, since ancient times, and throughout the history of art, fine arts, archaeology, and we have kept on copying to learn from the masters for preservation issues, or sometimes just because we thought that those objects were really interesting, were even fashionable. And all these motivations, they let's say underlay not only traditional approaches to copying, to recording, but also to let's say the act of the relationship that we have with these ancient objects, regardless the technology that we choose to use. And I think that looking at very digital technologies like photogrammetry or laser scanning or 3D printing, comparing it, looking at where they come from, can help us understanding some of the methodological issues around the use of these technologies that have a long history themselves. And I'm going to talk about some of these issues, and I will use a case study that is something I'm particularly familiar with, but I think it's also quite a topical case study, which is the city of Pompeii. And it is a quite iconic case study because Pompeii is one of the most reproduced places in the history of archaeology. So there are a lot of reproductions of things that have been found in Pompeii, houses, artifacts, and so on. But it's the history of this, especially of the early recordings, is somehow telling, because at the beginning it was in the early years of the excavations, it was actually forbidden to produce copies of the artifacts. So those let's say bootleg copies that some of the allowed guests decided to sneak outside the site were actually incredibly valuable for the people that couldn't afford or were not allowed to go to Pompeii themselves. And they became quite popular. They were printed and disseminated. And they are definitely crucial today also to look at things that do not exist anymore in their materiality. So I don't want to question the importance of these recordings, but people started noticing in the following years that these recordings that became sometimes so popular were not always that accurate, and in particular that sometimes there was, let's say, some sort of predefined actions that were, going on in the reproductions. This is just one of the many examples that you can find around, and you can see that this is a fresco that is in Herculaneum, and you can see that, yeah, well, we get the general idea of what's going on in that image, but this cannot be considered, let's say, a faithful reproduction. And people, started becoming a little bit upset because they went to Pompeii expecting something very classical, let's say, but they were, confronted with the reality of Pompeii, which is, some of the frescoes are really, poor quality, the anatomy is what it is, and so on. So people started realizing that there are actually a lot of variables that influence the way that we copy things, that go from, the skills of the person that is actually doing the drawings, the technological limitations. So another famous example are these quite popular reproductions of the frescoes of Pompeii. This one is particularly by Preston. They look, very, very, almost pop, and the colors look very flat. But this is not an accurate reproduction of what was, on the walls of Pompeian houses. It is much more about the printing technologies that were available at the time. But also, of course, the personal choices of the people that were producing these reproductions, if they had some preferences in the drawing style, or if they had explicit political agendas or cultural agendas, like the attempt on making these paintings looking much better, much more, let's say, refined than they were. And when photography entered the scene of archaeological and artistic reproduction, it was saluted as something that was, finally liberating us from the subjectivity of handmade drawings. But we now understand, and Eugenio talked a lot about this last week, that photography as well is far from objective, and actually it is influenced by, some of the same variables that were so crucial in the production of drawings and watercolors and things like that. There are, again, the skills of the person taking the photograph. I'm sure that you all have taken horrible photographs sometimes, and you understand what I'm talking about. And there are, again, technical limitations that can, influence the outcome. I'm showing here something that you have probably seen already. It went viral on social media, and this is an example, one of the few examples of portraits of people in Victorian times that are actually smiling. And that is, partly due to the fact that exposure time for taking a picture at the time, was quite long. So people tended to be, very, very stiff to get a good result in the photograph. But also because, smiling was sort of frowned upon during those times. So there were also cultural trends, cultural bias, which also explains why exactly in those same times, and this is another, quite popular picture that you might have seen online. In those same years, British photographers that were taking pictures of people in China that, had a different attitude towards smiling, have a complete different flavor. And this is just to give you really, just a taste of how many things influence the final aspect of a photograph, and how much in common there is between, these two technologies, even if they look different, and even if photography looks so objective. But actually, as Eugenio told us last week, photography is far from objective, and there are a lot of choices that a photographer takes and that make that photograph their own. And this is why we pay to go to museums to look at exhibitions of a particular photographer, Man Ray or Henri Cartier-Bresson. And there are, of course, the technical choices like where to position the lights, the expressive choices, the aperture time, exposure times, and things like that. But I would say that the very first choice, the place where really the authorship of the photograph lives is, in the choice of what to photograph. And I'm not talking only about, this very important thing that is what to put in the frame, what to include and what to exclude, let's say, how you select what is relevant to you in your image, in your composition. But even more, at the one step above that is actually the choice of the subject, is what you deem interesting, valuable, and worth of being recorded and shown, to other people. So some photographers, focus on objects, others on people, and sometimes on the everyday life of children. And in spite of photography slowly becoming accepted as one of the fine arts, you'd be surprised to find out that still in the 1980s, experts in semiotics that you would think they had a more refined approach to this. People like Roland Barthes would call photographs messages without a code, because photographs are just what they are. They don't need to be decoded, they don't need to be interpreted. They have only one meaning, which is what is on the image. But I absolutely don't agree with that. And I believe that so much of the meaning of an image is in the context. And that, this is one of my favorite anecdotes from the history of cinema that I've stolen from Eisenstein and his essays of film theory. And he's talking about a movie that is shown in Russia. It was about Danton, and it ends with Danton consoling a crying Robespierre. But actually, the movie was originally German, and in the original version, what people see is Danton actually spitting in Robespierre's face. So a cheek with a little bit of water is not a self-explanatory image and can be reused and repurposed when we put it in a different context. And again, you would think that when 3D imaging arrived, being initially, especially through photogrammetry, that is basically the use of photographs to produce 3D images, one would expect that all those methodological ideas that we have developed, all those critical approaches that we have developed towards photography would have been inherited by 3D imaging. But actually the opposite happened, that all the misleading expectations that we had initially with photography about objectivity, about complete accuracy, were instead inherited by these new 3D technologies. And again, you would be surprised to find out how many papers today still claim that this or that digital project produced a perfect copy, a perfect replica, a perfect reconstruction of an existing object. And I would like to argue that that is not even possible. That if you put, a number of people in a room and ask them to produce a 3D image of the same object, even if they use the same equipment and the same software, they won't produce identical results. And which is why it is so important to document 3D imaging as well. And I think that this is one of the other dangers in assuming that 3D images, the digital photography, are objective ways of recording things, that because you think that they are objective, you assume that they don't need to be documented. So I think we have a loss on the methodological side, but also a loss on the practical side of it. And I would like to conclude this introduction that I know it wasn't very technical, but I know that Emma and Gabi will make up for that. Is that definitely it is true that both photography and 3D imaging have enhanced the accuracy of our record. It is undeniable, and is actually a great win for, especially for archaeologists, for people working in art conservation. They have really opened up new exciting venues of investigation thanks to the enhanced accuracy. On the other hand, I would say that maybe we don't always have to aim for the maximum accuracy. And what I mean is that maybe there are other applications that involve 3D imaging that are not necessarily related to this millimetric accuracy, and that a lot can be done, for example, with 3D images of cultural heritage when we let, for example, people play with it and mix them and manipulate them and even create sort of monsters putting together pieces of cultural heritage, because this may be a way to connect the general public with the cultural heritage. For example, the image that I'm showing here is a competition that Sketchfab launched for reinventing images of cultural heritage. And that was the end of my and I am now handing over to Emma. Sorry, I'm trying to get Emma in the main screen.
On the little square for Emma at the bottom of the screen, there's just on the top left
Great.
of her.
Yes, found it. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so hello. I'm going to give a quick technical overview into some of the range of different types of 3D imaging available, which we can divide into different categories. So first of all, I want to look at penetrative imaging systems. So by this, I mean those that can be used to look at the internal structure of an object. So the main type of this kind of imaging used in cultural heritage is computed tomography, more commonly known as CT scanning, which uses X-rays to build a 3D model of an object. So I'm just going to try and share a slide here. So hopefully that's visible. So a beam of radiation is applied to the object, behind which is a detector, and this records any radiation that has passed through the object. So an X-ray displays the extent to which X-ray radiation has penetrated the object. In these images, so this is just a standard X-ray, but just to show the principle, bright white areas indicate the presence of materials penetrated only to a very limited extent, while dark areas signify materials that are more transparent to the radiation applied. So in this case, this is a clay figure with a metal armature inside it. And the extent to which X-rays can pass through an object is known as its radio density. And this is connected to both the density and the atomic weight of its composite materials. As density and atomic weight increase, so does radio density. Tomography, then, is the term used to describe the imaging of the internal structure of objects in section. So CT scanning involves taking a series of X-ray images of multiple evenly spaced orientations by revolving this radiation beam and the digital detector around the object. The cross-sections are then reconstructed to create a 3D model from which cross-section slices or tomograms can be extracted for analysis. Advances in micro-CT scanning also means that high-resolution imaging of very small objects is also now possible. Of course, using this method means that you have to have access to a really expensive CT scanner. But if money is no object and you manage to have access to one, then you might also like to use neutron tomography. I'm just going to remove the slides for a second, I think. So we'll go back can do that. Good. Neutron tomography works very much like CT scanning, but uses a beam of neutrons instead of X-rays. So over the last decade, the potential of this technology has rapidly advanced with the development of new and more sensitive techniques, and also the sensors. Neutron tomography can be used in complement with CT scanning, since neutrons and X-rays interact differently with different materials. So the principle of radiodensity doesn't actually apply to neutron imaging. While X-rays can easily penetrate materials made from lighter elements like organics, neutrons can be readily scattered and absorbed by many such elements, including hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen. Conversely, unlike X-rays, neutrons can easily penetrate layers of dense metal. So this means that neutron imaging can present a much more sensitive method for investigating organics and hydrogenous materials, for metallurgical studies where the metals are very thick, and for exploring composite objects, particularly those that have light materials contained within heavier metallic materials. So this might include organics found within metallic or stone matrices, and also waterlogged ceramics, leather, and wood. CT scanning would be of limited use in these cases because the heavier materials block the view of the lighter ones. And one of the problems, though, with neutron imaging is not just the cost of the equipment, but the fact that neutron radiation is really quite dangerous, much more dangerous than X-ray radiation. The object being imaged can absorb neutrons from the neutron beam and produce radioactive isotopes. So these are generally short-lived, and the length of time for which an object remains radioactive depends on the intensity of the neutron source and on the length of the exposure. What it does mean, though, is that it may not be immediately safe for an object to be returned to its collection. In order to prevent objects from staying radioactive for long periods of time, the neutron beams employed for analysis are typically rather less intense than those from X-ray sources, but this does mean that it's harder to obtain high-resolution images. On the other hand, though, if we don't need to look inside an object, surface imaging methods like 3D scanning and photogrammetry, which we've mentioned, while not allowing you to see inside, can provide very high-resolution images of an object's shape and its surface texture. And again, while some of these techniques can still involve very expensive equipment, there are also more affordable options, making these methods more widely available. So 3D laser scanning is one of the most common types of 3D scanning. The laser beam is reflected by the object and recorded by a sensor, creating a series of data points that allow a point cloud of the object to be constructed. I'm just going to try and open some slides again. So hopefully these slides will be visible. And so this point cloud created is essentially a raw output of data consisting of a series of coordinates fixed in space. In order to gather this data, you might use one of two types of laser scanning, time of flight or triangulation. So time of flight laser scanning is also known as LiDAR, light direction and ranging. It sends a laser pulse towards the object and generates the point cloud by calculating the length of time the laser takes to be reflected back to the scanner. These are particularly useful for imaging large sites and objects, including aerial scanning. Triangulation is used for smaller objects. It can be used to calculate the coordinates for the point cloud because there is a fixed known distance between the laser source and the sensor, which form a sort of triangle with the laser dot on the object. And the angles of the laser source and the sensors are also known. This sort of equipment typically offers greater accuracy than time of flight scanning, but the operating distance is much smaller. For the best effects, normally you need to be within around a meter of the object. And triangulation can also be disrupted by bright sunlight and changing weather conditions, unlike time of flight. So the latter would normally be used for large external objects, while triangulation is generally more suitable for smaller objects in a museum setting. Within the subset of triangulation, there are different methods, not always based on lasers. So the one that I'm most familiar with is structured light scanning. This is a triangulation-based 3D scanning system, which has two cameras and a projection unit. So the projector illuminates the object with a known pattern of linear stripes of light, known as fringe patterns. each stripe of light projected onto the object is identified with a number, and the cameras then observe the extent to which the light patterns are distorted on the surface of the object. Because the cameras capture this information from fixed predefined viewing angles, we can then get precise coordinates for the construction of a point cloud using triangulation. Again, one of the downsides of these types of 3D imaging, both laser and structured light scanning, is that they're quite expensive. High-end models will cost at least £10,000, but there are now cheaper models available. Photogrammetry, on the other hand, which we're going to focus on, I think, quite a lot in this section, is a type of 3D imaging of growing importance, in part because it's typically more affordable than laser scanning or structured light scanning. So photogrammetry allows point clouds to be constructed from standard digital photographs, which means that you really only need a camera, at least for the source images. So these should be a series of photographs providing different but overlapping views of an object. The creation of a 3D model then relies on the photogrammetry software tool that you choose. So 3D scanners will often come with their own proprietary software, enabling you to build a point cloud and construct a mesh. But for photogrammetry, there are a range of options to choose from, some more and some less expensive. And in photogrammetry, the software will first generate a sparse cloud of tie points. These are matching features across different photographs. And from that, then the dense point cloud is created by calculating the 3D coordinates of positions all over the object. And once you have a point cloud, either from photogrammetry or laser scanning, within your chosen software package, you can then build a mesh of the object and add texture. Unlike a point cloud, which is, as the name suggests, a series of points, the mesh is a 3D model constructed from the data points in the point cloud and composed of polygons connected to form a surface. So it's often known as a triangular mesh. And the creation of this mesh is important because it means that you can go on to 3D print your model or apply texture. And the quality of this mesh will depend on your point cloud. So for a good mesh, you really need a good point cloud made from many accurate data points. And so for testing out projects and for learning about photogrammetry, there are a few different options. So 3D Zephyr by 3D Flow seems to be one of the most commonly used because there's a free version which allows you to make models with up to 50 photographs. There are various paid options if you want to do more than this. The problem for me with 3D Zephyr is that it's only suitable for Windows and I use a Mac. So the software that I use and that a lot of people I know use is Agisoft Metashape. You can get a free trial of this one, but after that you'll have to pay. However, it's not all that expensive. So if you're eligible for an educational license, then I think the standard version is around £70. Other software includes reality capture, which I haven't used myself, but have had very good reports about. And so many say it's superior to Metashape, but again, this is paid for and only available for Windows. But even once you've created a model using a software package like one of these, or indeed from one of the proprietary 3D scanner ones, assuming you're careful with your file types, you should be able to export your mesh into various different programs. And generally, for that, you'll want to avoid saving your work only in a proprietary file type. So, for example, FBX is a proprietary file type owned by Autodesk, and so it may be difficult to use in other software suites. Some of the best open and widely used file types are the STL, which is stereolithography, OBJ, and PLY, the polygon file format. So STL is the most common and easy to work with. It's widely accepted, but it does only contain a single color, so that it's really just the triangular representation. OBJ can also contain texture information, and PLY can contain texture information and colors. So there are advantages and disadvantages to these. For further processing of your 3D models, MeshLab is a commonly used open source software, which will allow you to clean and edit your 3D mesh. And Cloud Compare is another open source software for point cloud and mesh processing. And both of these also allow you to measure the geometric distance between two 3D models, which can be a useful tool, which I will show in some of the examples a bit later on. In these, you can also do hole filling if you have gaps in your data, and you can smooth rough areas, which might be important if you have specular objects that create a lot of noise. So that's sort of my technical overview, and I will move straight on to applications. So there are various advantages and disadvantages to all of these techniques, which we've touched upon already, and particularly are related to cost. And there's also the issue of objectivity, as Valeria has discussed. But provided that we stay aware of these issues and limitations, 3D imaging can be put to effective use in many different applications within cultural heritage. So I'm just going to talk through a few examples where different types of 3D imaging have been used in different scenarios. So one of the most obvious is the creation of a 3D record of the object, which can be used for many reasons and purposes. Accessibility to objects can be improved by allowing people from all over the world to view digital models of objects from various sites and museums. So Sketchfab here is an important platform that I haven't yet mentioned. It allows you to view 3D models that other people have uploaded, and you can also publish your own on their website. Increasingly, museums are uploading 3D models of their objects onto Sketchfab, like this one from the British Museum. And there are plenty of other initiatives too, like the Uffizi Digitization Project, which has put more than 300 models of sculptures from the Uffizi Gallery in Florence online. So having a 3D archival record of cultural heritage objects is also particularly important for conservators, because by comparing 3D models created at different points in time, you can more effectively track changes in condition. So I know at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, for example, photogrammetry has been used to create 3D models of organic objects before and after they go on loan, so that any dimensional alterations, usually caused by changing environmental conditions, can be detected and monitored. Photogrammetry has also allowed mounts to be made for objects so that they fit exactly without having to handle the object too much, to take lots of measurements, or subjecting it to more interventive processes of moulding. This sort of shape matching has also been used to digitally connect fragmentary objects, for instance, to match up fresco fragments from the archaeological site of Akrotiri. And this can help both with actual physical assembly of objects and virtual assembly if physical assembly isn't possible or desirable, if, for instance, they're in different museums or something like that. And not forgetting that although 3D models, whether still just digital or in a 3D printed form, cannot replace the original, they do mean that if the worst should happen, we still have a full record of the object and the capacity to replace it, or perhaps to repair it more accurately if it's salvageable. So I believe that 3D scans of Notre Dame are being used to help with its reconstruction after the devastating fire earlier this year. And of course, there have been lots of 3D scans and prints relating to the Arch of Palmyra. The fact, if we return to penetrative imaging, the fact that those based on X-rays or neutrons allow us to look at the internal structure of objects is another feature that's really useful for conservators. So the most famous cases are probably those of the Egyptian mummies wheeled into hospital CT scanners so that they can be investigated without being unwrapped. But there are many more uses to which this can be put. So Roman coins, for example, have been identified even while they're still inside the pot they were found in, meaning that we don't need to destroy the assemblage in order to learn about them. So high-resolution micro-CT scanning has also been tested to try to virtually unwrap papyrus scrolls like the carbonized papyri found at Herculaneum. These scrolls could well contain important ancient texts thought to be lost, but they're so fragile that it's pretty much impossible to physically unroll them without risking destruction. And being able to digitally unroll and read scrolls in this way, though, relies on the pigment used for the inks having a different radio density to that of the substrate, the papyrus. And so work is still ongoing to try and image these effectively, but I have noticed I've been following this, and in the last few months, they seem to have made some progress by sort of combining micro-CT scanning with different sorts of multispectral imaging. But we'll see what happens with that. As I've mentioned, neutron imaging is a complementary technique to CT scanning, and at the moment is still more commonly used in 2D than 3D, so I won't dwell on it for too long. But it does have quite exciting potential to be used by conservators, particularly regarding the application of consolidants to stabilize objects. So for instance, neutron imaging has been used successfully to detect the presence of consolidants applied to a knife from the Roman site of Indonassa in Switzerland. X-ray imaging, by contrast, had revealed only empty space. And so neutron imaging can be used not only to look at the final distribution of the applied consolidant, but it can also be employed to compare the uptake behavior of different consolidants and solvents when applied to objects. This means that we can look at the state of old conservation treatments as well as assessing the efficacy of new ones. The geometric models produced by 3D imaging, like laser scanning, can also be used by conservators. So the digital Michelangelo project subjected a 3D model of the David statue to a simulation of historical environmental conditions, looking at its exposure to surface contaminants, including dust, rain, and mist. And this can help us to understand how an object has deteriorated over time and can help with the development of appropriate conservation interventions. So looking at how objects have changed over time is something that I focused on particularly in a project comparing 3D models of original sculptures with historical plaster casts taken at different points in time. So I looked particularly at the West frieze of the Parthenon, for which there is a long documented history of comparison between plaster casts and marble sculptures, as we can see in these photographs from the Illustrated London News in 1929. So unlike much of the Parthenon frieze, which was removed by Lord Elgin in the early 19th century, the West frieze remained in place until the early 1990s. Elgin did, however, take a set of these casts, a set of the sculptures in 1802, which are the casts used in these photographs here. But there was also a second, later set of casts requested by the British Museum to be taken directly from the sculptures a few years later in 1872. So I've used 3D imaging to compare these groups of objects to try to understand how the marble sculptures have changed over time, from 1802 to 1872 to the present day. So I used a Brickman Smart Scanner, which is based on structured light scanning, to scan both sets of casts held by the British Museum and the original sculptures at the Acropolis Museum in Athens. I then compared the meshes of the casts and the original to map and quantify the differences between them. So to do this, I use Brickman's proprietary software AutoCAD. However, you can use MeshLab or Cloud Compare to do this sort of analysis. And using this analysis, you can create deviation maps, which give a sort of color-coded temperature map with green and yellow areas showing the closest matching areas between the corresponding cast and original, while the oranges and reds signify greater difference between the cast and original. So the analysis revealed that both sets of casts taken from the Parthenon sculptures were very high quality, reproducing the originals very closely. The 1872 casts are remarkably close to the present-day marble sculptures, suggesting that even through 20th century pollution, the rate of deterioration has still been fairly slow. So the maximum deviation limit for this map here is 5 millimeters. It shows that the cast reproduces the original of this figure consistently within 5 millimeters, with the exception of the small grey patch on the arm, which is above this set limit. If we refine the limit further down to 1 millimeter, then we can see that, again, with the exception of a few grey patches, the majority is reproduced within 1 millimeter. So the green areas here are closer to 0, and the red and orange areas closer to the 1 millimeter limit. As suggested by the news reports, however, the quantitative comparisons showed that there were areas of more significant change when we compared to the earlier 1802 casts. So these appeared to retain some surface features lost both from the original marble sculptures and from the later 1872 casts. So this is the 1 millimeter limit deviation map comparing the original marble sculpture and the 1802 cast. We can see that much less of it is reproduced within the limit of 1 millimeter, indicated by the grey areas. And we can see that the face of this figure is still present here. So analysis of the surface morphology of the originals in the 3D models showed or suggested that this was the result of a combination of environmental weathering and deliberate damage by people, either petty attacks on the sculptures or attempts to remove particular features. However, it also showed that there were places where the people who had created Elgin's molds and casts appeared to have restored certain features in clay. Therefore, the overall declining condition is less than appears to be the case upon initial visual inspection. and based on these pure quantitative comparisons. So you still need to use your own subjective analysis to a certain degree. But it does show here how useful 3D imaging can be for investigating changes in objects over time. And the scanning of plaster casts is particularly useful because it's much more suited to imaging than highly specular materials like marble. So scanning marble can be very difficult because it's so shiny, which means that in laser scanning, structured light scanning, and photogrammetry, you can get a lot of reflections and noise in the data. So I found that my scans of plaster casts were much more useful for looking at fine tool details than the original marble sculptures, both for this reason and because of the later deterioration of the marble. And this old weathered marble is not nearly as hard to image as more recent polished marble, as I've been discovering in a new project. So this is one I've just started, but I'm looking at different methods used to carve marble sculptures from models in antiquity and through to the 19th century. So some of my 19th century examples have involved looking at the plaster models and marble sculptures made by Canova. So because I need to record sculptural features found all over the object, photogrammetry is a really useful way for me to record these without having to take and compile many different 2D images. And what I also want to do is to compare the mesh between the plaster model and the marble sculpture to see how closely the finished piece reproduces the model. But I have had some problems creating a good mesh of the very shiny marble. So as you can see in this slide, the model of the plaster model on the left is much, much cleaner than the one of the finished marble on the right. So this is really still a work in progress. But as you may have seen in some of the reading material, these sorts of comparisons have also been used to compare multiple versions of finished sculptures of the same type, focused particularly on trying to attribute with greater certainty statues to particular Greek sculptors, especially by looking at instances where parts of an original sculptor's model may have been reused. Personally, I find this work more compelling regarding what it may reveal for broader sculptural practice than questions of authorship, but it does show the wide range of different uses to which this sort of comparative imaging can be put. And so I shall return to the shared screen. If I hand back, I think, to Valeria or Gabby.
Valeria, you're still muted.
Yes, now, thank you. now it's Gabby it's going to tell us more about 3D printing.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I want to talk briefly about the use of 3D imaging in general for engagement and teaching. So the less research and more communicating heritage through 3D imaging. And I'm going to focus on printing because that's like the next step, if you like, one possible next step. And as my example, before I move to the slides, the example that I'm going to use in the slides when I talk about the practical aspect is going to be this Kylix, which I have several different models, as you can see, all slightly different sizes, as I was experimenting with getting it the right size, one even bigger. This is the one that's actually about this is the perfect model, right? That follows the dimensions of the original, which is about 11 centimeters, and so it's an unusual size for a Kylix. This is not a wine glass. This is most of what a vodka glass at the very most. So having a physical model of this, is potentially of interest. So if we can switch to my slides, please, Valeria.
Should be on.
No, we're seeing your screen.
Oh, that's
or someone else's screen. Yeah.
Huh.
Thank you. So yes, so I'm going to talk about the printing aspect of this, and so I'm going to talk about very briefly about two aspects of printing and reasons why we might use 3D printing, and then I'll go on to talk very briefly about some of the practicalities of printing, and I want to sort of race through all this. So advantages in 3D printing if you are a heritage institution, for example, in terms of communicating to the public. One is that with this plastic object that I showed you a minute ago, you can hand this out and allow people to handle these objects, which you can't necessarily a fragile original. The original object may it may not be physically in the location that the public are in. It may be in a different institution, a different country. It may be very fragile. It may not be on display for whatever reason. You may not want to let people handle the original objects. So this gives you the potential to handle that. You can also make multiple copies, as you saw. I have here. So that, if you have a room full of 100 people, you can pass out a couple of dozen copies, and it's not just one copy that people can see. The copies are disposable. Printing one of these costs a few pence, less than £1 anyway, certainly to print one of these, if you don't count the time of the person keeping an eye on the printer for 4 hours. So if you're handing it around the room and someone drops it and it breaks, then you don't really care, whereas you would for the original. If someone steals it, fine. It's not very nice, but nevertheless, if it gets wet, if someone decides, let's see what it's like to drink vodka out of this, or wine, or water, or whatever, it's a risk you can take with this object. It's a risk to their health rather than to the object. And so it gives the audience the sort of direct engagement with the object. You can discuss, for example, you can have a group discussing the function of the object, the aesthetic of having an object of this particular size or this particular shape, while physically holding the object and while passing it between them, and you can make discussions of this kind. And this all helps with the heritage institution's duty to engage the public in this way. The heritage institutions exist for the public as much as they exist for researchers and educators. So having the public engaged in that way is something that's very important, and printing can, I think, very much help with that. The other aspect of this is the slightly more educational, very similar, a lot in common with engagement, but this is specifically where the people being engaged with the objects, the people physically handling the objects, are students of cultural heritage or archaeology, or whatever, like some of the students in this course, for example, and having a 3D printout of a model of an object gives you this slightly more sensory encounter with an object than you would get from looking at a photograph, from looking at an object through glass in a museum, and so forth. So you can get a sense of its shape, what it would be like to hold something this size, that sort of thing. Has to be borne in mind, of course, that the plastic object that I was holding in my hand was not the same color as the original object, was a lot lighter than a ceramic object. The texture is different. So there's all sorts of ways in which it doesn't give you sensory accuracy, but nevertheless it's something slightly more suitable than just looking at, as I say, as a 2D image. There are accessibility implications of being able to handle an object, which some students might not be able to see fully. Although it should be borne in mind that this isn't a substitute for access to the real objects. But where access to touching the real objects is not possible, the 3D object is the next best thing. 3D printing as a process can also be used to give students experience of designing and making an object, whether they're making it via photogrammetry or whether they're designing a new object themselves. It can also be used for a sense of experimental reconstruction. If you have a broken object with part missing, you can say, well, what would it look like if we reconstruct it in various ways, and then have these handled in the class and see which ones we think are convincing. They can be, exemplary reference objects. When teaching Greek ceramics, you would very often have, course books or handouts which have drawings of the various different types of pots that the students need to know about, having physical examples of things of that shape in front of you is that little bit more convincing even than these drawings. 3D models can document both the condition of an object as it is and any interpretation that we might have made of the object. And one of the most interesting things you can do, and I think Valeria may talk about this in a minute, is to actually play with these objects in some way. So whether with the design process or with the object itself, potentially putting these objects to unexpected or unintended uses, I think is also something that's valuable. It's engaging and it has pedagogical value. But I want to talk very quickly now, just for the last couple of minutes, about the practice of 3D printing. Anyone who's based here in the Institute of Classical Studies can, if they really want to, for an assessed project or similar, can come and talk to us about printing an object that they've created, either in this session or in the 3D modeling session in a couple of weeks. So we have a 3D printer, so I'll just very quickly explain how the 3D printer works. 3D printing of the kind that's done by our printer is a form of additive manufacturing, which means that the printer starts with a blank, empty base and adds layers of material to it to eventually create an object. And what this means is it adds it layer by layer, as you see in this slide, that it's nice and easy so long as each layer is smaller than the layer below, or at least not bigger than, or not much bigger than the layer below. In particular, if one layer has an overhang, that causes problems because it cannot place a layer over empty air. That would cause problems. So we'll come back to how we deal with that in a moment, because not all objects are conveniently pyramid shaped. So we start with a real object. This is a photograph of the original of the object that I showed you the 3D model of a minute ago, and we start by imaging that in some way, whether this is with photogrammetry as we'll be doing, or through any of the other methods that Emma has talked about. We then end up with a 3D model in some 3D software, which we can rotate in that software and look at the various parts of. We can also repair that model. When I scanned this tiny calyx, I didn't model the base, so I had to sculpt the base to make it roughly the shape that we intended to be. And I just hope that nobody looks at the bottom of an object, because that's not a particularly authentic part of the printout. We then can position and size the 3D model using the printer software, as we see an example here. And this is where I can set it to be 11.1 centimeters from handle to handle to get it as close as possible to the original size. And here is how we deal with the issue of these overhanging handles. We put supports underneath those handles that are printed, and then we cut those off afterwards. And so this is something that we do in the printing software. The printer software then converts that to a digital file, which says this is the path the filament will take in creating this model, and this will take 1 hour and 23 minutes. According to the thing, it usually takes closer to 2 hours. It tends to be optimistic in its estimation of how long things will take to print. And this model can then be saved into a file, which is then loaded into the printer. This is something that we always forget is exactly how 2D printers work, right? When you print something in your laser printer, you're creating a digital file which tells the laser printer which points on the paper to make black and which points on the paper to make other shades or other colors. And that's a digital file that we used to. Those of us who were using computers back in the 1980s have to create a PostScript file and manually get that sent to the printer in some way. And this is very much the same process. Worth saying a word about the filaments that we use. There are two filaments that are the most commonly used, and they're the two that we have access to. Those include ABS, which is a plastic filament, which is slightly more durable and waterproof, but prints at a higher temperature because it takes more heat to melt it. And PLA, which is a slightly more degradable, so it's not something you would want to be able to print garden furniture or cooking utensils out of. but it does print at a lower temperature and is therefore less polluting to the environment as well. 3D printing can also be done in many other materials, plastics, metals. Houses can be 3D printed in concrete. People have 3D printed using chocolate to make novelty sweets and anything else you can imagine. And then the final output will look something like this. And this is one of the models that I had in my hand a minute ago. But the final version to come out of the printer with those filaments still in place. Those filaments then have to be cut off before they could be before the object looked the way we want it to look. And Valeria, if you turn off my slides again and go back to showing me, I'll show the 3D model again on the screen. That's the that's the 3D model with the base that I don't want people to look at, and the handles that now look, it now looks reasonable with those supports chopped off. So back over to Valeria.
Great, thank you both, Emma and Gabby, for this very interesting and rich overview of the applications of both 3D imaging and printing. I would just like to add a little appendix of what Gabby was talking about, and I will use some slides for that. It's really just a short comment that is related to 3D imaging, but especially to 3D printing maybe. And okay, there is a common misunderstanding, or let's say a common misperception of digital objects as immaterial, as ephemeral, as things that are sort of made of thin air. And yes, of course, they don't have most of times a body that you can touch, but they do have some sort of materiality in general. I mean, they require sometimes servers, they require hardware and software, and all sorts of things. So everyone that works with digital files has already been disillusioned about the immateriality of digital objects. But I think that in particular, when we talk about producing copies of existing objects or creating new digital objects, there is really a craft component to it. And I think that is an interesting it is an interesting key to use when looking at 3D imaging and 3D printing, to consider it part of making of the making movement, if you want to call it like that. And if you think, for example, of, and you will try that yourself when you have to make a photogrammetric model of an object, you do need some practical skills to do that. You need to set up the room in a certain way, to think about the light, to think about your own movement around the objects, to think about maybe putting some supports below the objects, and so on. We will talk more about that during our tutorial. But I mean, also creating, for example, an architectural CAD model, a 3D model of a building, also involves choosing, for example, the textures for the different materials, and thinking of the geometric layout and things like that. That, of course, you're not actually choosing a material. You're not choosing, the type of wood or the type of stone. But I think that, looking at these virtual materials, in a way, helps you thinking about the ancient materials. And these digital ways of making help you think about, the ancient material ways of making objects and houses and statues and things like that. But absolutely nothing, there is no other digital technology like 3D printing that really has, a handy, a crafty component like 3D printing. And as Gabby showed you, you have to think about the material that you are melting. You have to think about the temperature. You have to think about the supports. By the way, yeah, if you wanted to have an idea of how crazy supports look like, you can look at this picture here. And then sometimes you have to tweak the model. With your hands, you have to maybe file it a little bit. You may want to varnish it, or you can even, if you like, even end up painting it. So that was just to say that I think that it is interesting, it is valuable to think of these 3D technologies as making techniques, or technologies that are related to the ancient technologies and the ancient ways of making. So now
Could you show us the 3D model you painted again? We saw that far too quickly.
Oh no. Let me go back to...
No, just the one you had in your hand.
Yeah. Oh, wait. It was... where did it go? There it is. It is a dinosaur embryo. I think it's a little bit out of focus, though. I'm happy to show it. I'm happy to bring it to the class for this is a 3D printed model. You see, it was a one single color plastic that has been painted with acrylic to give the idea of a baby dinosaur, basically. Okay, I'm now going to walk you quickly through a photogrammetry tutorial, and before we start, as Emma said, photogrammetry is a very, very affordable technology. Basically, what you need is a digital camera. Your mobile phone is already perfect. Actually, I've seen some of the students have quite excellent cameras on their phones, and then you need a software to process the pictures. The software that we suggest is Metashape, the software that also Emma talked about. You will find in the GitHub page a link to download it. You can use the demo version as long as you like. It has all the features, but you cannot export your model in the demo version, which means you cannot, for example, print it, or you cannot refine it and post-process it in another software. You can also request the trial version, which will last 30 days. In the trial version, you can do anything. You can also export your model, but bear in mind that you won't be able to use it after on the 31st day after it. So for example, if you want to use photogrammetry for your assessment, maybe think about the timing. Also, for the students in London, bear in mind that there are copies of Metashape available in the computer room in the ICS. Now let's start with I think you will also find the tutorial in the GitHub page. Okay, so one thing about photogrammetry is that the secret is in taking the right pictures. It's not that much about having a fantastic and expensive camera, but it is about taking the right pictures. So how to take the right pictures? These are images from the Metashape manual that show you how to take the correct position to take pictures. So we will focus on the isolated object case, and you can see that basically what you have to do is go around the object 360 degrees. It is not always possible to reach an object on all its sides, but let's assume that in an ideal world we always can. So this is what we are supposed to do. I will show you better how to position the camera with a model just in a few moments. Before I show you in more detail how to take pictures, of an object, just a few preliminary information, some very, very crucial things that you have to bear in mind. So one is about position. So the object that you want to image must remain always in the same position. You cannot move it during the photography process. If you move your target, you have to start over. Some people are tempted to move the object to reach better some occluded areas. That unfortunately is just not possible. If you move your object by mistake, I'm afraid you have to start again. Light is very important because photogrammetry, is a technology that is based on photography. So of course, light is a key component. So the target should be as much as possible evenly lit. Which is not always, easy to control, but as much as we can, we should try to guarantee that. If you're taking photogrammetry outdoor, try to avoid those times of day when the shadows are particularly long, because you are also, quite likely to project a shadow yourself on the image. If you're taking photogrammetry, if you're doing photogrammetry indoors, it is a little bit easier to control light sources, but for example, be careful of the kind of light that comes from a window. Maybe it might be better to close the window, obscure the window, and have more control on the artificial light as a suggestion. Focus again is very important. All pictures have to be crisp and sharp. The object has to be on focus. And I've noticed that especially when using mobile phones, sometimes when you take a lot of pictures one after the other, focus might tend to shift, to change. So be sure when you take your picture that the object is well in focus. And we will see later when we will talk briefly about processing the images that you have go through the images that you have taken. If there are any blurred ones, just delete them, don't process them. You get better results with fewer pictures that are all clear than with more pictures that are partly blurred. So now, actually, to talk about surfaces and how to position ourselves during the photogrammetry, I'm going to use some objects. So this is our sample object today. This is very precious, ancient Japanese object. The way in which it is advisable to take a photograph for photogrammetry, and bear in mind this is one possible approach. There are others. If you Google, if you get interested, you will find other tutorials. The important thing is that every point on the surface of this object that we want to image has to be in at least 2 photographs that you're taking to do the photogrammetry. Now, how to achieve that, how to be sure or reasonably sure that you have covered twice every single point on this on the surface. You can find your own method. What I do is basically dividing my object into, let's say an ideal grid. So for objects like this that develop, on a more vertical axis, I basically try to divide the object, let's say in 2 or 3 zones, let's say 3. And then I go around the object like we have seen in that image at the very beginning. I go 360 degrees around the object, and I take a picture every time. And as Emma said, I ensure that there is an overlap of at least 40–50% for each picture. So I start focusing maybe only on the lower side, and I take a picture, and then I move a little bit and I take another picture, ensuring the overlap, then another picture, ensuring the overlap, and so on, until I've gone around 360 degrees, focusing only on the lower part. Then I move on the middle part, ensuring that the overlap is not only horizontal when I go around it, but it's also between my vertical segmentation of the object, and I go around again. Now, when you complete your photogrammetry, you may notice, or when you go about it, that there are some areas that are more complicated than others, and some areas that are less reachable than others. So looking at our crocodile friend here, for example, the area beneath the chin is probably gonna be absent from some of the pictures, or even more so the inside of the mouth. So after you finish your photogrammetry, pay attention to all those areas that you might have missed. Look for those areas that are less visible, that are less reachable, like the underarm, the inside of the hand, and so on, and take extra pictures, take a closer picture. Again, in an ideal world, it would be better to have a consistent distance from the object, but if you want to take some close-ups of some specific details, the software is perfectly able to cope with that. If you are working with an object that is actually quite flat, like this other crocodile friend, you may want to consider, maybe putting it on a support or something, so that you can take pictures, from below. And again, don't be tempted to take, one rounded picture like this and one rounded picture this way, and then stitch them together, because that is not going to work. Your target must remain still. If you're interested in, an area of the object that is not reachable, if not all the areas are reachable at the same time, what you can do is creating two separate models with two separate photogrammetries, and then trying to join them in post-processing. So about the choice of objects, bear in mind the photogrammetry is not always the best method for imaging an object, as Emma was telling us before when talking about marble and shiny surfaces. Do I have a shiny surface? I thought I did. Okay. Anyway, reflectant surfaces. Yeah, there it is. I have a shiny surface. So reflectant and shiny surfaces are not good for photogrammetry, because they reflect the light too much. Also, transparent surfaces are not good, so you cannot use photogrammetry, for example, a glass, an object made of glass. There are other solutions, but photogrammetry is definitely not the best choice. Also, very fuzzy, furry, and crisscrossing surfaces are usually not a good match with photogrammetry. First, because they're very rarely, completely still, but also because it would be really, really difficult, to reach every point that you are interested in. Sorry. Another thing that doesn't work very well with photogrammetry are very repetitive surfaces, like, for example, an entire wall that has, the same wallpaper or the same pattern that repeats. That's because, the photogrammetry softwares needs to have some reference points to extrapolate the 3D images. So sometimes, if you are worried that, for example, you are imaging a vase that, it is a little bit dull, it is not, the surface is not, diverse, is not varied enough, and you are a little bit worried that photogrammetry is not going to turn great, you can do something to, let's say, help out the software. So one very common method is to put your object on a sheet of printed paper. A newspaper is, a daily newspaper is perfect. Be careful not to choose a shiny printed paper, like a leaflet or a publicity thing, because that wouldn't work well. But a newspaper is absolutely perfect. Or any way that you can give the software some extra reference points. I mean, you can put some colored, sticky notes around it, or dyes of different colors, or you find what works best for you. I think that I have given you pretty much all the information that you need to try your first photogrammetry. And please, go do experiments, try it, and the first ones are going to look, really not great, but you need to practice. Your first one will be terrible, the second one will be, the third one will start, looking good. And last tip that I can share is don't forget, the top of your object, especially if it's something that is slightly, higher than you, and in general, don't forget, the top view. Because a lot of very good photogrammetry have that's a big classic have a little hole on the top, so please don't forget that. So once you have your photographs, you download your photographs, you are ready to create a photogrammetry on our software that is Metashape. So you may find online some references, some tutorials to Metashape that refer to it with its forward name, which was Photoscan. Feel free to use them. The interface is absolutely the same, and you can use those resources. So to process the photos in Metashape, it's absolutely, it's very easy. Basically, what you have to do is to follow one by one the steps that are in the workflow menu. And you stop here at build texture. So you align your pictures, you then build a dense cloud. They are all steps, one after the other that you just follow. Then you build the mesh, and then you add the texture. For every of the steps, you can choose a level of, let's say, accuracy of resolution. Of course, the higher the resolution, the more power the computer needs and the more time the computer needs to process it. So even though, it's quite tempting to always go for, the highest definition because you want to see your model looking really good, also be realistic about, the capacity of what, your hardware, your computer can, realistically reach. If it says that it's going to take a few hours, that's normal. That's how much does it take sometimes. If you think that your computer is not good enough to process the photos, again, contact us if you're in London, and you may use the computers that are in our computer room. And we have maybe a few minutes for discussion now, and I would really like to invite Alicia to join us. And Alicia was the main contributor to the digitization of the ICS collection, the Ehrenberg bequest. So you can see your beautiful models on the ICS page on the Sketchfab. But if Emma or Gabby want to ask questions to each other or want to make some final comment.
Is there a link to the Ehrenberg Sketchfab page on the session page for this session?
No, I think it's not.
I'm gonna add it. I'm gonna add it because I think that'd be useful for the students to look at. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Alicia.
Yeah, Valeria mentioned most of the things that I was gonna contribute to, but one thing you mentioned, the issue with reflective objects and how they're not great for photogrammetry. That's something I dealt with a lot. The only suggestion I have is to use a chalk powder or something like that to matte the surface. Of course, it's not recommended for archaeological objects. And the only other way around that I found, not with photogrammetry, but with laser scanning, doing it in a dark room so that there's less light for the laser to reflect off of. But again, I haven't found a solution for photogrammetry of archaeological material. So, yeah. And, the only other thing I had, Emma, when you're mentioning the post-processing software, you mentioned MeshLab and Cloud Compare, and the other software that I've found useful would be Mesh Mixer, which is quite user-friendly, and Blender, which is more of a learning curve, but it's got a lot of capabilities. Yeah, so that's my 2 other suggestions.
Yeah, I think that Mesh Mixer is also quite user-friendly. I think that it's more intuitive than something like MeshLab that is more refined and gives you more control, but it can be a little bit off-putting for a complete beginner because it has a lot of options. While Mesh Mixer is a little bit more playful. So, I mean, again, they are both available in the lab if you feel that, and they're both free actually. That's the other point. So, Mesh Mixer is not an open source software, but it is free, for now. So you can download and play with it.
Mm-hmm. And you can use all of them on Macs as well, which is the problem I run into for a lot of software.
Yes. Actually, there is a free option for photogrammetry. I should have mentioned that actually does work on both Mac and PC, which is Visual SFM. It is not the easiest and most user-friendly software, but if someone is really motivated and they have really zero budget, Visual SFM is an opportunity, and I think that it has quite a lot of documentation. So even if you're not an expert, an IT wizard, you can find help online from the community. Good.
A brief note about the quality settings in I've forgotten its new name.
Metashape.
We use in Metashape.
Yeah.
So they all come, as you said, in low, medium, and high quality. And if you were to set them to high quality, if you have a decent number of photographs, enough to make a decent thing, it would literally take hours. Sometimes it could be 36 hours to get a full process on. Even on the, we've got a fairly high-powered graphics machine in the ICS, which is a little bit faster than that. But even on that, it's it can be quite slow to do a high-quality measure. So low quality will already give you an idea of whether your model works, and if you go from through all 4 steps of it in low quality, and it's only taken about 20 minutes, you might want to take a chance at trying it again in medium quality and see if that only takes an hour or 2. That might still be doable. The other thing, again, this is something I got from watching Alicia work a few months ago, was that you might do just the first step of aligning the photographs in low quality, which will already show you if there's any big holes in your object, in your model. And then if you haven't moved the object, you can go back and take some more photos to fill those gaps, add them, and do it again. And then once you've got a good coverage of the model, you can then do it in a slightly higher quality and potentially get a better model out of that. So there's various things worth trying out.
Absolutely. That was a very good tip. So we have already overrun our time. So I think I'm going to thank all our guests for today, and I don't see any questions this time from the people following on YouTube. So thank you again, and see you next week.
Thanks, ciao.
Thanks.